Okay, guys, we're going to continue our discussion of fantasy basketball deep dive strategy. I'm here with Casey Scheinvold, also known as Vlad to the Bone. I don't even know your basketball name. We'll have to come back to that. And Ross the Boss.
I'm Ross the Boss, and I want to talk basketball fantasy with you, cowboy.
That was so calm, Ross.
I know.
Have you taken a sedative?
Is basketball
I can't be
fantasy
crazy all the
different
time.
than fantasy basketball?
Yeah, you can't keep up that level. I mean,
I got a
you'd
reputation.
start to fall
Let's
asleep.
go.
Okay,
What's
so
the subject today? What's the subject today, Dr. Dan?
yeah, the subject today is that fantasy basketball, in my opinion, is not as much of a speculation game as some of the other sports are. I think it's much more based on usage, and you've got to understand usage. So here's the thing I wanted to ask you guys. How do we interpret past performance in basketball? Season to season, I want to hear about how do things change? How do you understand this?
There's players that you know are going to have huge games. You can't deny it. You know they're going to be huge. Doesn't matter where they go. They can play in Houston. They can play in Brooklyn. Doesn't matter. They're going to have the games that they have. But there's the players that come in. About usage is a weird word because if you go on the waiver wire, there's always waiver wires action with percentages going up and down because of three reasons. And you're saying, Ross, what are those three reasons? Big game.
I'll say it, Ross. What are those three reasons?
Big game, bad game, injuries. So injury is a main aspect we have to look at fantasy. You got to look at injuries and what's going on with your team when you look at usage because that determines a lot. Another thing is like a beat for the Sixers. He's down. People are picking up Dwight Howard, which I think Dwight Howard's not the same player anymore. He's not the same guy. I think it's a horrible pickup. Ross the Boss wouldn't do it. I'd rather pick up somebody else, but that's Ross the Boss. I like Maxey there. There's a few other players I like in Sixers. We talk about that later. But long story short, that with usage, you got to look at who's healthy and who's not.
Okay, so that makes sense to me in terms of this season. You're looking, take Enes Kanter, for example. So Nurkic, sorry, Casey.
I know.
I just remembered your team name from that. Isn't that amazing?
I have to change it from Nurk Alert to Nurk is hurt.
Yes, exactly.
So Nurkic, he's out for like a month or 2 months.
Weeks.
He's out for two months,
Do you want to give
me
Enes Kanter, by the way, Dan?
Sure, I'll give him to you, but not for free. I guess that's not giving. All right, we'll talk trade next time. We're going to talk about trades.
Okay, fair enough.
That's our favorite topic.
Talk about Enes Kanter. I like this.
So Enes Kanter, he like Ross was saying, this is a guy whose usage is going to go way up, but you've got to understand what you're getting. You're going to get his usage way up for maybe 2 months. After that, I don't know. In the meantime, it's going to depend on how he performs. If he doesn't perform that well, you may find that his usage starts to go down. So if you see the minutes going down, you got to understand how to interpret it. You got to keep track of the news. You got to see who's in the coach's doghouse. There's all kinds of things you want to pay attention to understand the usage. But I do want to jump back for a sec because, when people look at this season's numbers next year and they look at Enes Kanter, they're going to be like, oh, he had a pretty good year. That doesn't mean you want to draft him next year because he may not have the same role. Casey, what do you have to say about this?
When I think of usage, obviously, I think we touched on this last week a little bit in our last episode. We talked about whether they're empty minutes versus useful minutes. The person I think of as kind of like the prototypical value change for usage is Brandon Ingram. Like when he was in LA, he was considered almost a bust. He was a high round pick who never made any dent because he wasn't utilized properly or didn't get a lot of usage in their system. He goes to New Orleans and now he's, there's arguments that he could be a triple-double waiting to happen almost every night because suddenly he's within the flow of the offense and he's a focal point of the offense. And so you look at his value from year to year, and that's where usage can really be helpful in that respect.
Great point, because that's something you want to think about. When a player switches teams, there's a lot of things that can change. I made this mistake with Hassan Whiteside. I predicted he would have a big season, but the shift to Sacramento did not go at all as I expected. And if you looked at it, you might have seen it coming. He had a huge fantasy year last year, but some of it was because Nurkic was hurt. And so
and Dan, another thing you got to consider is the coach. Like Doc Rivers in Philadelphia, he loves rotating his point guards. He rotates his point guards a lot compared to any other coach in the league. So let's say a guy like Shake Milton, who I love Shake Milton. I mean,
Great name, too.
I think the guy, I agree. I love his name. We talked about it. He gets steals, he gets points. He had 20 points last time he played. The reason he's such a great pickup is that he gets in the rotation and Doc Rivers loves the guy. So you got to consider the coach too. Who's coaching the team? How much does the coach really depend on this player? And how much game time does he actually get? And a guy like Shake Milton for the Sixers is a great example of a coach that loves point guards and loves rotating him in the rotation as much as he can. And that determines usage. And that's what you got to figure out as you being your manager of your own team.
All right, now I did want to say, for those of you who are watching and haven't done it already, click subscribe, ring the bell for notifications, and put your comments below. We want to hear from you on how you interpret past performance. How do you understand what these players are doing? What is usage? Let's hear from you. So, guys, another thing I wanted to bring up in relation to this, and we touched on this last time some, but the idea of average stats versus season stats, or even if you're looking at the last 2 weeks, how do you guys use that to understand what players are out there? Casey, we're going to start with you. You're
okay, well, I
seat.
tend to shy away from the average stats, certainly early in the season, because when you've only played 10 to 15 games, one big game one outlier can skew your stats in one direction or another. When you look at the full season, then you can look at more averages because you can maybe you have a larger sample size with which to rely. And so it can be a lot more useful. I tend to look at trends over games in the past 5 to 10 games and see if there's movement in one direction or another. And then you can remove an outlier where either they went, a really good 3-point shooter for some reason went 1 for 9 from 3-point land. You can throw that out because that's not really a common thing for them. Or vice versa. Somebody went off for 35 points, even though they didn't score more than 8 to 10 points in any other game.
Yeah, or you may see somebody who has a really high ranking and you look and they're shooting 80%.
Right.
You have to know what is sustainable. Nobody's going to shoot 80% from the field. It doesn't. I mean, look, there are guys who've shot like maybe 750 if they're centers who are just always putting in layups and dunks. But you have to understand what is sustainable, and you have to understand what's kind of a trend. I will say the place where average stats to me are the most helpful is if you're looking at last year's performance. And I agree with Casey. It has to be over a big enough sample size that the numbers are meaningful.
See, I'm the opposite, Dr. Dan. I'm totally the opposite. When I'm picking up a player, I use this tool on Yahoo, and anybody can use it. You go to the 7-day average. You go to that and you look at the 7-day average for all the stats for every player that's in waivers. You can look at that, and that will determine who I like to pick up. So I look at the past 7 days. I don't care at all about last year. And the other key word that people love to use is streamers. And a streamer is a player that's going to get playing time because a certain player on their team is not playing. So that streamer is going to getting minutes. He'll get points. But as soon as that player comes back, that player is back on the bench. So if you want to play a streamer for 1 week, that's a great idea. But you better be aware when that starter coming back because your player is not going to need more playing time.
Now, I agree with that, Ross. Some of those things.
That's fine.
But I was ready to. Go ahead.
It's Ross the Boss philosophy. You don't have to take it for you. You don't have to do it yourself. No. I just tell you what Ross the Boss does. What Dr. Dan does is a whole different thing. What Batch of the Bone Casey does is a whole other thing also. But that's what Ross the Boss does. And if you want to be a winner, like me, you got to do what I do.
Now, here's what I do. I'm going to say it really fast. Then we'll go to you, Casey, and then we're wrapping up on this.
Okay.
I like to look at the last 14 days, especially. That's my favorite one because 7 is such a small sample size. But I like to look at average stats, then I like to look at total stats, and then I like to look at the game log to see what's happening. And then if there was an outlier in minutes, I like to delve into that a little bit. I don't do this with every player, but if you are looking at who to pick up, try to know your players. Casey, let's finish up on you.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar. I agree with Ross and disagree with him. I think looking at the last 7 or 14-day average to get maybe a list of players who suddenly are ranked a lot higher is useful. But then from that point, you have to don't just take it at face value based on the average stats. You then go through the game logs and see if there's the outlier, see if there's an increase in minutes, or if they had a not playing. Because a 7-day average, if they only played in one game that week and they scored 24 points, but they've only played 2 other games in the 3 weeks before it, the 7-day average doesn't tell you anything.
Yeah, a little tip-off. If somebody's got a really high average and you've never heard of who they are, click on that and see if they played more than one game. Okay, guys, for those of you who have not already done so, click subscribe, hit like, ring the bell for notifications, and you won't miss any of our key information about how to become a fantasy monster.